Hi, it's Steve Hargadon and Reed Hepler, and this is This Week in AI, again on a Tuesday as we finish this boot camp for libraries and librarians. Reed and I have been spending a significant amount of time today talking about a new boot camp that we're creating on professional productivity with ChatGPT and AI. So look for that because it's coming. Okay, Reed, this last week, no lack of news again. Feels like there's so much going on. Do you want to start with anything, or shall I go down my list?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is a lot of the Apple announcements, but we're going to talk more about that later. But it kind of shows how um, AI is becoming more of a ubiquitous thing. It's not something that's going away, and big companies are actively placing AI tools and AI elements into their products, and it's not something we can come away from or run away from, that they're going to be integrated. And so it's not an option to not thinking about AI because it's going to be all over the place.
I think that's a really good point. I also think that it's showing us at least the beginnings of a progression away from the kind of open source hacking ethos of prompt engineering to AI being embedded in programs.
Hmm.
So this idea that you need to learn to be a prompt engineer feels to me like it's true for the moment, but it's going to, number one, the large language models are going to get better and better at asking you and helping you make good prompts. But number two is you may not be spending as much time with the large language models as you are with their integrations into products.
Yeah.
My Samsung did a similar thing some weeks ago and integrated AI into my phone. The technologies are amazing. I haven't been using them that much. Like it has a live translate feature where you can turn it on and show text and even have your earbuds in and have it translate for you simultaneously. I want to use it. I'm excited about it, but again, there's so much else going on. I just haven't implemented it yet.
It's kind of a race to see, or kind of a game, like which AI development am I going to take advantage of and look at, and which AI development and I'm going to say no, I'll wait for that a little bit. I mean, with the Rabbit R1, um, I every day I look at kind of the development of the Rabbit R1 and the improvements that they have and the feedback that they're getting from people, and I'm glad that I kind of took a back seat because the reviews are not really that great. Whereas if, I would have jumped in and said, "Oh, this is an AI agent, it's really cool," I probably would have been very disappointed. But it's very interesting.
I know you were very excited about getting the
I
rabbit.
was. I was very excited, and I was like, "I'm gonna get it. I'm gonna be in the first batch." And now it's like what, batch number 8 or something, or batch number 7. And I'm glad that I didn't get it yet. Maybe I'll get it next year. But a lot of people are saying with the product this bad at this early being released before it's ready, it could be that it doesn't even last for another year. So
Yeah. So there's
it'd
the
be very interesting.
Humane Pen and Rabbit, both kind of in the news for disappointing releases of physical products.
Hmm.
Um, I've made the argument with you, and I'm not sure that you actually fully agree with me, that I don't see why you would invent both hardware and software at the same time. Like the
Yeah.
Humane Pen, I kind of get because the idea that you could look at something on your palm, but it's such a dramatic shift in user behavior and habit that it seems like you're facing such big hurdles to get people to do that. I mean, Google Glass closed down after a while because it's just really hard to get people to change behavior patterns, especially if you have this really smart phone in your hand. But the second one, the Rabbit, has been interesting to me because I feel like if you're going to work on software that acts as an agent and makes good decisions for you, why build the hardware too? Just have it as an app on your phone, right? Why wouldn't you just have that agent in your phone rather than having a separate device? And you've made the point, well, so you don't have to carry your phone. I want to carry my phone.
Well, it has all this other stuff, and so if you want to incorporate all these different apps into the AI, it would make sense. You would want the AI to be an app itself. Yeah, you want it to be just connected with everything else instead of having to plug it into your computer or plug it into your phone and then have it away from you or have it away from the phone. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it just felt to me like it was trying to solve two big problems, which would just make it almost impossible to come out with something really novel and really good. Although people love
Yeah.
that rabbit, uh, the initial announcement. Okay, so I wanted to focus for just a minute on an essay that came out from Ethan Mollick. And he was responding to the Apple announcements. And he talked about the difference between advanced or frontier models of AI, large language models, or narrow focus, smaller models. And he said, what we're seeing from Apple is a clear and practical vision of how AI can help most users without a lot of effort today. In doing so, they are hiding much of the power and quirks of large language models from their users. And I thought, okay, I was sort of wondering why Apple was taking so long to come into the market. But if you think about it, that is very smart to make sure that the voice agent or whatever it is, Siri, is able to accomplish very productive tasks without a lot of the sort of weirdness that we've been seeing from the large language models, and especially the Google search piece.
Mm-hmm.
But also, they announced pretty strict intentions for privacy, and I thought, oh, okay, that's a win for Apple as well, because I feel like they have a good history in that area, and so
Yes.
I felt a little bit less like they'd taken so long to actually come out with this. Um, did you have any responses or reactions to what was announced?
Well, it's interesting because there are a lot of people, and because I know about the other AI tools, and I mean, everybody does, it's hard not to, but because, um, a lot of people are fearing that an AI tool and a specific AI platform and a specific AI um, iteration model for Apple is going to have problems and have a lot of issues because all the other AI tools have had issues. And I'm prone to agree with that. But you do mention that they did take a long time, which implies that they're doing their due diligence. They're studying these things. They're analyzing the market. They're analyzing what people will and will not want. And so they might have been doing it really well so that people won't have issues with it. And so it won't be awful. But I'm thinking that if current trends are continuing, then the future Apple, like the release of these things, actual release, I think they'll probably have 75% good things, but 25% issues. But it could be better. You never know. So yeah.
Yeah, the same article talks about, uh, Ethan says, to a large extent, the future of AI will be shaped by the degree to which AI companies figure out sustainable business models. So expect to see more experimentation. And it is interesting to think of Apple as sort of taking a slower backseat role when they've been known so far for being, for producing just like stunningly innovative products. But I think this rush to profit that you and I have talked about
Hmm.
does seem to connect to the Leopold Aschenbrenner essay, 165-page essay that he released. I have not read it, but he essentially is sort of predicting the next 10 years of AI. And he said two things that were of interest to me. One was that AGI, artificial general intelligence, is probably going to be a reality in 2027.
Hmm.
And he said that, let me actually read the words from the article here. He said, um, he's predicting significant advancements in AI technology in the near future. He predicts that there will be an intelligence explosion where AI goes from human level to superhuman capabilities. He says this transition is likely to happen because AI can automate and accelerate its research and development. So he was fired from OpenAI. As I recall, they said that he had spoken about things that he was under contract not to speak about. But it
Hmm.
was also part of the reduction of this super alignment group that was overseeing safety at OpenAI. And I think there were a lot of concerns that there isn't enough of a concern about the dangers. So what I'm hearing in this story is once you hit artificial general intelligence or this sort of very human-like capability, that they're going to task the artificial general intelligence with getting to artificial superior intelligence. And so the transition will be much faster than we think because the AI will be collaborating in the production of the next generation of AI. I don't have any scientific basis for this, but I actually feel like that makes a lot of sense to me.
Hmm. Yeah, well, especially if one of the agents has been working and has been trained correctly, and then it's kind of like how we train humans, um, that they're going to train each other, and you
Good
know,
connection.
a little bit that
Generative.
we exactly generative teaching for generative models,
Yeah.
basically. So yeah.
Okay, so if you're interested in any of these articles that we're about to discuss briefly, these articles that we're going to do brief discussions on, you can go to futureofai.org and click on the news tab, and there is a news feed. It's news.futureofai.org, and these articles are all posted there.
Mhm.
Um, Reed, you put in multiple education institutions offering AI certificates or focus in programs.
So yes, so it's interesting because I go out and I go on LinkedIn and find these news articles or what I perceive as news, and then I can't find half the stuff that your news.futureofai.org site has. So it's really interesting that we have different kind of ways of collecting information. But um, I have several connections at several institute. Maine is doing one. I know that Bouchard is doing one. Um, Multiple areas. I think Idaho as a state is going to do one soon, but they're going to offer AI certificates or an AI focus in their non-AI programs so that you can have, an AI emphasis in law or an AI emphasis in environmental science or things like that, or get a certificate in AI to couple with your bachelor's or a master's degree so that you can show like, hey, I've been learning about AI. And I've talked about this a little bit with multiple professionals, and we're basically saying, yes, they're good for students, but if you're a professional, you really need to be looking at developing a portfolio and looking at the projects and presentations and things that you have. Having a position or having a certificate or a degree is not as important as actually having that experience and demonstrating it through the things you're creating and doing and communicating. So yes, for students, I encourage all bachelor students have at least an emphasis in AI or at least take an AI class. Because yeah, educational institutions are learning that AI is going to be essential knowledge in at some level in virtually all fields and domains. And that's kind of what we're hoping to do with our future professional development in AI bootcamp thing is because we know that it's going to be important. And so we're kind of trying to have a subject agnostic work bootcamp to help with workers. But educational institutions are also offering that too. So yeah.
I don't want to sound jaded here, but I it's interesting to me when I hear about an educational institution talking about creating certification or training in AI. I feel like that will always be months to possibly years behind. So
Hmm.
I can remember I went to Stanford. So I started Classroom 2.0, which was a social network for educators, and was sort of early on in the social media adoption in the education space. And I remember going to a Stanford university meeting on social media, and the people who were there at Stanford, they were a couple of years behind, but they acted as though they were on the forefront and that everybody would look to them to be the leader in what was going on. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Not only is there a rush to profit, but there's a little bit of a rush to being the expert. And there's so much that's changing so fast in AI that I feel like that would be an unattainable goal at this point.
Well, and that's where it's interesting. With every technological thing or every advancement in the field, there are problems. With the educators think, oh, I know all about this and I know the best theories. Well, by the time they've developed the theory and framework for using the first thing, then, you know, the practitioners have already done other things and they've developed new ways that make those frameworks obsolete. So that's why, and this is my personal view, and I know I'll get flack for it, it's best to be a theoretician practitioner or just to be a practitioner who researches because you have to be both. It's kind of like where with AI or with any technology or any viewpoint, you can't be anti and you can't be overwhelmingly pro. You have to be centrist in some ways. You have to acknowledge the benefits and the challenges, etc. So education has always had that issue, and especially I know that with like Stanford High, which I'm listening to currently, well, today, um, they are always like, yes, we have these theories, but how is the field applying AI, and how can we speak to what they're doing right now rather than what they should be doing or what we want them to be doing in future years? What do they actually need and doing right now? And I think a lot of people are scared. They think that working with practitioners is somehow selling out or somehow um, like not best practice. But I think that you need to be working with practitioners. So that's my rant
Yeah.
on practitioners. But that's the point, is that educators need to acknowledge that they won't be the expert unless they actually get some practice. So
Yeah, I think it's a longer conversation to have another day about kind
yes.
of the pressures of being in higher ed and tenure and the expectations for publishing. Where I mean, all I can remember is sitting in this auditorium and one of the professors saying, "We need to teach everybody about how blogs work," and I'm like, as I
Yeah.
recall, he didn't even have a blog or a following, and there were people in the audience who were practitioners who'd been blogging for several years at that point and had so much more knowledge. But it was this sense of, well, this is what I do. I'm the expert, and I get that. I get that's what goes on. It's just I guess it's just part of the dynamic.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Yeah.
some other quick takes on stories. One of the stories at news.futureofai.org was about the concern that there's going to be a brick wall of no more training data, that AI advancement will stall without training data, or that the companies will have to have the AIs themselves create the training data, which introduces some sense of imbalance or bias in the material. There was an article about generative AI postings increasing tenfold in the past year. And I
Hmm.
think in the past 2 or 3 years, it was like 75-fold. Um,
Wow.
there's a really interesting story about a fake beauty queen contest, the Miss AI pageant. People from all over the world have submitted AI uh, replica people, but they've created a whole personality and they have Instagram accounts and they have thousands to tens of thousands of followers and they are active in certain specialty areas. This was a really weird story because I thought,
Hmm.
okay, this is actually going to fulfill some of the things we've thought about in terms of science fiction. If tens of thousands of people are following a a constructed personality that is intended to create a sense of interest or attraction, it's, it's kind of hard to imagine how that will not happen. Any thoughts?
It's interesting because you never know things are going to how things are going to go. It could be that this is a huge issue or a huge kind of trendsetter. Like it could be that with businesses, like you could have AI spokespeople. You could have AI using um like with the so I'm trying to combine multiple things here. If AI tools and we talked about AI tools training each other to go over the issue of no more training data. If they train each other on no more training data, and we have these fake beauty queens, and we have these chats and these job postings, and it just trains on it itself, we could eventually have kind of an AI-centric community, an AI-centric economy, or an AI-centric world where the only thing that people think about, or the only thing that people think is is important, is whatever the AI says it is. And Ethan Motte kind of talks about that in Co-Intelligence in his chapter 4 book, where AI will create reports or will create social media posts, and then AI is going to analyze those, and then AI is going to give action items, and then AI is going to do all of these things. And so I don't know how eventually you could have these these products, these spokespersons for companies, or a chat that's moderated by an AI tool, and it wouldn't do things based on what people want. It could do things based on what the AI has been training the AI has been training the AI to do. So you never know, and it's kind of scary. And we talked about, and I don't know, we might talk about this later about kind of the singularity happening, and how, and last time we talked about it, was it 2 times ago, we talked about me thinking that it's not going to really happen. But I think it will, in a way of AI kind of pervading society and pervading what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so it's interesting to think that something as simple as privacy, or as intimacy, artificial intimacy, could go further than it typically does with people, because AI tools are thinking that that's okay. And so you never know what's going. That was kind of a rant, and it kind of went off on a little tangent, but you never
Okay.
know what's going to happen.
I guess I'm interested in this at two levels. Like, one is that we have this Paleolithic brain and emotions that are easy to tap into,
Hmm.
right? And so you get a pretty face, you get pornography, you get a sultry voice. As these things become more real and realistic, it's hard to imagine uh, having natural defenses to them, because there will be an incentive to get past our natural defenses and getting us to
Yes.
purchase or to pay attention.
Hmm.
I think the second aspect of this that's interesting to me, and we talked about this in the boot camp, was that there's this enormous amount of psychographic data that Facebook and other companies have been collecting, which they use to market to us. So they're figuring out how we work, what our
Hmm.
emotions are, what our interests are, and when they go together and where and how. And so you combine that kind of deeper understanding, which I believe they have. They don't, of course, they're not going to release that to us, but I think it would be really interesting to know what the research in the last several years has been. But combining that with artificial intelligence and the ability to customize messages and to have an artificial companion that knows your interests and kind of knows how you're going to respond, and with the profit motive and the desire for profitability and power, it seems like we're going to face some very interesting challenges in where these companies are likely to go with that combination of uh, attracting, speaking to our emotions and our more physical side, um, and attracting us to paying attention or spending money.
Hmm.
There was an article that you had pointed out, that's also in the futureofai.org news blog about DuckDuckGo, allowing you to do private AI chats, so that the IP address comes from them and the data all comes from them. So there's just no way to track it back to you, apparently. Um, I don't know that that's necessarily foolproof, but it does seem like a positive thing.
Well, it's
If you're
interesting because my rant earlier about like the AI training each other. When you talk to me about the last post, the beauty pageant post, you went down to the DuckDuckGo private AI chats, and I thought beauty models, private AI chats, and then I went down one more to that storytelling, and we're going to talk about this thing where ChatGPT is storytelling. It has these voices. And if we have private chats and voices that can change based on what people want, and then the images, you know, combine those three, and you have all sorts of things that can happen. And so it's very, very kind of, and who knows, with those chats could come, if they aren't private, if they are hacked, like you talked about, DuckDuckGo, you know, and I remember this once you reminded me before we talked, um, they did sell that data to other people, and they said it was for, I don't remember what purpose it was for, but yeah, there's all sorts of things. They could sell those private AI chats if you have, private AI, models that you're talking to or whatever. They could sell that data. Of course, that's, one of the kind of pandering to the lowest human instinct a little bit, but that still is private information, and who knows what it could happen if it isn't kept private. So,
Yeah.
but let's go on to another lighter thing again.
Well, no, but that's
ChatGPT is
yeah. Go
ChatGPT
ahead.
is storytelling, and it's interesting. The preview and demo is really intriguing of the different voices that they can have just for the storytelling.
Yeah,
So
you can tell it to tell a story. You can tell it to take voices for the characters. You can ask it to modify the voices of the characters. So, I mean, this is really interesting, right? I mean, it seems phenomenally fun that you could do this. And I guess I am interested in my own personal reaction to a lot of this, which is like we were talking about with the phone and the AI integration. Some of this is happening so fast it's hard for me to integrate it into my actual life. And so it'll be interesting to see which things settle out and which seem to be really interesting at the moment, and then which had staying power. So, uh, um,
mhm.
yeah, I do want to say with regard to the data, it's been pretty clear over the last several years that organizations, commercial organizations, can buy anonymized data, but then they can use clues to put that data together and to
Yes, they
actually
can.
pinpoint and track the users. So this is the concern about Facebook requiring that you opt out in kind of an obscure way from their using that data. Um, again, this may be one of humanity's bigger fights, right? I mean, we certainly,
Mm.
some of our greatest literature, 1984 included, sort of this understanding, or Fahrenheit 451, of how much do you really want powerful technologies and individuals overseeing or knowing everything that's kind of going on in your life. There's another story. Google playing crackdown on apps for deepfake nudes. Seems like that's about time, right? Because I guess there's a very public story about a girl some kid at school took a regular photograph of her and then deepfaked it into a nude, and she's taken it to court. This clearly is going to happen, but it shouldn't be happening under the auspices of our larger corporations and trusted institutions.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Um, a story about AI finding nearly 1 million potential antibiotic sources in nature. And this is where I think there's just a huge potential, right?
Yeah.
Anything medical, and looking through
Yes.
all of the medical records and doing what a human being couldn't do, and being able to go in and say, I have the following symptoms and these are the following things, and okay, track this and look for this, and being able to identify patterns and connections that would be very hard to do at a human level seems like a huge potential.
There's a lot
Okay,
that we can do. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Especially in nursing, the nursing field, well, and general medicine, but nursing is taking a huge cue from AI companies and AI tools. And there are a lot of, especially even at the community college level, there's a big push for medical AI, more so than in other sectors. And it kind of surprised me because you want to have everything as, precise as possible and have the best data. And you would think that AI would be kind of a turning point, a turnoff for them, but they really want to use AI. So really interesting.
Yeah, no, and it makes a lot of sense. It seems to me that we're at a stage where there has to be a lot of human oversight to make sure that once a connection is potentially made, that you check it out. Is it real? Is it accurate? But again, they're going to develop AIs to check other AIs. So it's, at some point before it gets to you, it's going to go through several gatekeeping mechanisms to try and verify that the data is accurate. At the same time, iatrogenic deaths because of medical interventions and hospital care, are so huge that it's a field ripe for better care, right? It's a field where there are already very significant issues. You can claim that there are very significant issues with sort of how our health care takes place,
Hmm.
and the negative impacts of that. And so, yeah, it seems like it should be really interesting to watch. ChatGPT had a big outage. It apparently affected more than just ChatGPT. I haven't read any more about it, but again, and you and I are getting ready. I'm doing my boot camp for libraries and librarians, and we're getting ready to do the one in July for um, professional productivity.
Hmm.
And certainly, we're going to record any interactions with the large language model and play them at the time, rather than try and do them live in case the system goes down. But
Oh, definitely.
clearly,
No, there have been a lot of people who have been talking about, and one of my colleagues was doing a presentation on AI, and half of it was built on her participants being able to use AI tools, and it just went down completely. And she was like, I wasn't able to do my presentation. And I was like, yeah, you should have prepared for that a little bit better. There are other tools you can use, but yeah, it's something you have to keep in mind.
I don't think we've gotten resolution on the Scarlett Johansson voice. I'm
No.
still bothered very much by the Scarlett Johansson Sky connection, the similar sounding names, with Sam Altman's tweeting out her when the voice was introduced. I
Hmm.
think Scarlett Johansson has a very strong case for saying, "Hey, you push the boundary here, and it's a boundary that we're going to see over and over again with improved video, like the beauty pageant, and consistent characters across lots of photographs now being consistent across video, and the ability to produce crafted material. This is something that's definitely going to happen. I wish OpenAI would actually come out and give us a better explanation for what happened. But there is a trust issue. Ethan Mollick talks about it in his article. Let me read just that quote. He says, what every one of these companies needs to succeed, however, is trust. There are a lot of reasons why people don't trust AI companies, from their unclear use of training data to their plans for an AI dominated future to their often opaque management. But what most people mean by trust is the question of privacy. Will AI use what I give it as training data? So I would say that's true for me. I went from being a huge sort of evangelist of AI with the original boot camp last year to sort of acknowledging this year that I'm feeling a little bit more like a voice of caution. Yeah,
Hmm.
these
Yeah.
are incredible tools. The large language models are amazing, but let's be careful to not think that they're everything and they're going to solve everything, and understand the potential areas of weakness or vulnerability where we have to be careful about what we use them for.
Well, it's kind of funny because my wife just told me, and actually I've heard this from multiple people. She's like, "You are the most anti-AI proponent that I know." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And she's like, "No, you like consider everything, and you like m more than not, you tell me bad things about AI or things to watch out for, and then you tell me how to use things. But it's always with the caveat of these are the things you have to watch out for." I was like, "Well, that's at least that I'm balanced." But I mean, I still think of myself as an AI consultant and a proponent of AI, but yeah, you have to keep thinking through things and have to constantly change your opinion based on what you know now versus what you knew, yeah, a year ago or even a week ago. But yeah, really interesting.
Okay, did we do our deep dive on Apple? Did we talk enough about that, or did you want to say anything
We
more?
have a little bit. We have talked about a little bit. I will refer everybody to Ethan Mollick's article. He released it actually today on Apple's AI and experimental models. And I'm just going to read a little bit of what he said. He says all of the tech companies have been releasing these sorts of small, fairly powerful models with the idea that they can handle simple questions on the hardware of your devices and then call a larger model in the cloud when they need help. You aren't getting anywhere near the smarts of a frontier model, but if you want to do straightforward things, these models are often more than enough. And Apple doesn't have really that, but they have a bunch of AI chips that they put it into Apple products. So it's not a huge frontier model, but it is just kind of enough AI for different faculties and different things. And so it's kind of it's interesting. I personally prefer the frontier models for a lot of generalized things. But if you're using a bunch of tools, it's better to have little simple AI features of each tool, in my mind, than have one huge tool that's also trying to do the small things. And so, for the purposes of Apple phones and Apple iPads, it's really interesting. And it really seems to be more effective. I don't know what will happen. I don't like Apple. I like Microsoft more than Apple, but it seems like in this instance, Apple is really doing really well and doing the right thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. The article for me was compelling because this idea that the smaller models are going to be able to do exactly what they say they're going to do, whereas the larger models, they're fuzzy. And so it makes sense to build on the narrow or smaller models for the task oriented stuff. Like when you say, hey, call so and so, or make me a reservation at this place. Maybe some of the rabbit kind of tasks where
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm wondering if there's a corollary between. I remember when fax machines came out, and it was such a big deal, right? And you would even have like the copy shop would have a fax machine, and you would fax from one copy shop to another one across the country or across the world, and you'd go in and get it at the copy shop. And then all of the sudden, fax machines just went away,
Yeah.
right? So like another corollary would be telegrams or the kind of the communication that took place before the internet,
Hmm.
right? So I remember planning a trip for a world trip for some friends of ours, and we had to send. I can't remember what they were called, but they were like a they were a form of a telegram. Somebody will remember and tell me. But then over the long haul, they were sufficient and useful and really made a difference. But then sort of instantly go away once you
Hmm.
have email.
Yeah,
Then the fax
definitely.
machine sort of instantly goes away once you have the internet and the ability to send images rather than. I mean, I remember the thousands and the FedEx fax machines, that were everywhere. So I am curious as to what will be sort of the equivalent. What's going to go away, and we're going to say, okay, that was an interesting stepping stone to something else, but it went away fast.
Yeah. In other words, what are the AI agents going to look like? Or are we going to have agents? We're going to have something completely different. Yeah.
I kind of feel that way about as much as I love our libraryrobot.org project. I kind of feel like custom GPTs might fall into that category,
A little
which
bit.
is
Yeah.
fun to create, fun to use, but they're not likely to be the sustaining form of the technology.
So that'll be our question for you guys in the forum for
Oh,
future of
good.
AI. Yeah. What do you think is going to be the next big feature of AI, and what do you think is going to be kind of the stepping stone to other things? Two questions
Yeah.
in one. Nice.
Come join us there because there's a lot of fun stuff at futureofai.org, but we have, people have gotten used to using Twitter and Facebook for a lot of that kind of forum conversation. But if you're open to it, we'd love to have some of those conversations take place there. Plus,
Yeah.
I'm still very interested in somehow figuring out how to do an AI movie weekly marathon or something because there's so many movies I've been collecting, both documentary and fictional around AI that would be really fun to talk about. So there's another week, Reed. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody. See you in a week or maybe a little bit more. Bye now.